Hi everybody, David here from Render. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. In this video, I want to look at a series of beginner mistakes. These are mistakes that I see my students make when they're first starting out in architectural rendering, and they're also mistakes that I know that I made at the start. Hopefully, you can pick up some tips and tricks and avoid making some of these beginner errors, and will hopefully improve the quality and standard of your render output. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. So the first issue we want to talk about is scale. All right, you can see we're in SketchUp here, and we've got a pretty basic project here. This was a beginner student project that I used a few years ago. And let's go ahead and just take a look. And you'll notice it's a pretty basic build. And one thing in particular may be striking you, and that is the door. This is really one of the most basic things that I see mistake-wise. Students, and myself included when I first started out, there's a lack of knowledge about really how big things should actually be. So for example, you can see our scale measurement over here on the left, which is a little over 5 feet. And there's a really good reason that SketchUp includes this. One, it helps viewers orientate themselves in 3D space, but it's also a really good scale measure. Okay, so for example, if we were to go ahead and move our figure over here to the right, you can see how pronouncedly large this door is actually looking. Now, this is something that, longtime ArchVis people will be kind of familiar with, but when you're first starting out, you may not realize just how big things should actually be. So for example, if we were to grab our tape measure here and just plot points from the corners, you can kind of see that this door is already 8 feet high. Now, one way we can sort of mitigate some of this is quite simple. Just learn off by heart the actual scale for objects. So for example, a standard door height in the US is really about 6 feet and roughly 8 inches. And so you can see, we can grab the scale bar and go ahead and bring this down quite substantially. And that's going to look just automatically a lot better. There we go. All right, let's go ahead and hide this really quickly. And we can assume that errors in scale are not just for doors. If we zoom in here, I'm going to go ahead and delete our scale reference and take a look around this room. And you can see it's a pretty basic room. It's just a simple student project to get them used to SketchUp. But you'll already notice there are a couple of problems. The first one that comes to my mind is this canvas over here. There's a tendency I've noticed in my students to, try and put artwork on the walls, which is totally fine and very cool, but a tendency to go ahead and just scale it up really, really, really large, and to the point where it's kind of coming off the wall hugely. You do have to be cognizant of how big the decorative elements are in your scene. And sometimes it's not easy to know how big things should actually be. So if we go ahead and just move this back over here and just position it in a more organic fashion, now we can maybe go ahead and scale it up to a more reasonable scale. And we can also use push-pull to push this into the wall a little bit, so it's not basically sticking out too large. You'll also notice that some of the furniture is not set to basically an equal scale. So when you're starting out, it really does pay attention to just figure out the baseline measurements for how things should actually be. You might also notice that the ceiling height is really, really high. Again, this comes from a tendency to build things based on how we think they are, but not necessarily how they're actually built in real life. The average ceiling height in the US is somewhere between 9 and up to 12 feet, depending on the room you're working in. Not so long ago, it used to be around 8 to 9 was the standard. Now you're seeing more and more high-ceilinged rooms. This is a trend that's very much started in home architecture and seems to be kind of, in my mind, going into other fields. High ceilings have become the standard, but you have to be careful that your high ceilings are not going up like 30 or 40 feet. Two more things you might notice as well when it comes to scale. Fixtures and elements. Oftentimes, when students discover the warehouse for the first time, they'll realize how easy it is to populate a room with decorative elements and furniture and decorations. But again, we're not awful mindful of how big things actually are. So for example, you can see here there's an attempt place to put some lights in your scene. And this one in particular looks really, really nice, but proportional to the room is really small. You can also see these lights up here have been taken directly from the warehouse and placed in the room without being particularly mindful of how big they are in either real life or how proportional they are in the actual shot. So these would need to be scaled up substantially for the entire scene to actually work. Now, you'll also notice there is a tendency for beginners to really just place objects again where they think they need to go, as opposed to where they would be put by the actual builders or by someone doing interior design. And that's really a topic for another video. Additionally, scale goes beyond just figuring out the size of a door and goes into other elements of your actual design. So if we take another look at this student project, which for a beginner is, I think, pretty nice all in all. There's some really good elements to this, but there are still some scale issues. Now, the first thing that'll probably come to mind is the door, because it is something we just talked about. You can see that, again, what's going on here is the impression of a door, but the height and the detail aren't there. In other words, this doesn't seem right to us. We may not be able to put our finger on exactly why, but part of that is the scale. Now, you'll also notice we have some really nice artwork here on the inside. Now, there is a tendency to try and fill the space. And one way that beginners will do this is basically to scale up objects that are in there. And so you can see that through this window was this back wall. And there was a desire to put something on the wall without necessarily thinking about how big artwork should or could really be in this space. And so what they did was effectively just scale it up to be really, really, really massive. Now, we can also see that there's an issue with the actual scaling of the texture map itself. You can see how, we're getting a huge amount of scale kind of problems with the texture map on the concrete. It's probably too large. We're seeing quite a lot of this porous detail, and it kind of throws the image off just a little bit. And in this last project, you can also see one more issue with scale. In this one, the door looks good and the greenery, that all looks pretty good. What's problematic is the overhang, this cantilever overhang that is suspiciously large and in many ways not viable. Between the overhang that's scaled to be too large and lastly, the windows themselves, you can see the actual plastic part of the windows on the exterior is probably just too large. In fact, this almost looks like, half an inch of thickness running around the actual windows themselves. And again, these are kind of small things, but scale matters. And your viewer may not exactly be able to put their finger on why something looks wrong, but they will know sort of intuitively that something is out of place. And we should point out, these projects that we looked at were student projects. And scale is one of those things that you will just constantly be working on. It's very similar to an artist always having to work on anatomy and proportion. For us, it's detail and scale. All right, let's move on and see some other common mistakes and what you can do to avoid them. The next thing we want to mention is bad models and really ways that you can avoid them and what you can do with those models to make them look a little bit better. Okay, one of the common mistakes that I see my students make early on is when they're tasked with building or designing a room and they look for furnishings, for example, beds or chairs, but even decorative items, they tend to grab really the first thing that comes along. Now, you can see that here. These are both two beds that I grabbed from the warehouse. And in many ways, we're really talking about the SketchUp workflow here. But you can see we've got one on the left here. It's not perfect. There are some problematic areas. You can kind of see that right here. And then we've got another bed model right over here. Both of them came from the warehouse, and both of them are very, very different, and very different in quality as well. Now, to my mind, the one on the left looks substantially better than the one on the right. And yet, you may be tempted to just grab the first bed that comes to mind. So, well, the tip is quite simple. Just don't grab the first one that comes. Let's go to the warehouse and let's see what we can actually do. All right, I'm going to open the 3D warehouse. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go to the home screen and I'm going to type in bed. Now, oftentimes, students, when they're first starting out, will literally just stay right here on the screen. And they'll look around for something, maybe this one right here, and go, that's a bed. I need a bed for my room. Download it, place it, and think they're done. But there's a lot more you can actually do here. The first thing you want to make sure is to maybe stay away from the products tab. There are mixed results here. For every bed that looks like this really beautiful one up here, you're going to come across other things that look really basic or simplistic. And to some degree, this is kind of the problem with the warehouse. Anyone can upload to the warehouse, regardless sort of skill, ability, or technical know-how. And so there's a lot of bad stuff up there. There's also, however, a lot of great stuff, but you've got to find it. So how do we find it? Well, ignoring the products and models tabs, I generally prefer to go to collections or catalogs. You're already starting to get a better set of models here. Catalogs, we can look at the beds here, and you can kind of see here, okay, some of these look really good. They may not be exactly what I'm looking for, but at least the standard is already being more consistent. Now, you can make that a little bit better by going up here to where it says relevance, and we can go ahead and change that to either popularity or likes. Now, I'll generally start with likes and see where we go from here. Okay, now you can kind of see we're getting some really quality stuff. Let's go back to collections, which are basically independent collections by SketchUp users, and take a look through some of these. So I'm going to go here to this concept house interiors, and you can see we've got some kind of beds that we kind of like. So these are going to be a little bit better. And really, you're just narrowing down your range of content. So we can start looking for more specific things. If you want to go one step further, though, than just using these catalogs and collections, we can actually step back here. And on the left, under category, go interior design and interior products, or even furniture. And this will, again, help narrow down the focus of the models that you're actually getting. So I'm going to click on beds. Here's SketchUp, and now you can see we're getting some pretty nice stuff. You still have to be very selective about your actual furniture, and you have to be mindful that the furniture you pick actually fits with the scene. So in other words, there's no point in doing maybe a modern interior luxury room and picking a bed that just stylistically doesn't fit it. So basically a little bit of thoughtfulness needs to go in there. Okay. You can also, though, go one step further. And let's take a look at that in D5. We've sent both models over here. And you could say, okay, well, I haven't gone ahead and changed the materials on this one, and I have here. Yes, that is kind of part of this. One thing I see students doing, and this is particularly on the SketchUp to either Lumion or to Twinmotion sort of path, is not changing the materials from the SketchUp materials to whatever your software's default is. If you're going from SketchUp to Lumion, you want to make sure that you apply a SketchUp standard material to everything that comes over from the warehouse. If you fail to do that, the rendering software will only be able to factor in the flat, diffuse texture map that came from SketchUp, which is usually okay-ish. But by applying a Lumion or a Twinmotion standard material, you get access to things like reflectivity or gloss. And this will really, really help. Everything in real life is to some degree slightly reflective to varying levels. And having a flat texture that doesn't really respond to light just kind of doesn't look good. Now, you can see over here in D5, I've gone ahead and applied some D5 materials. There are still problems with this model, and I probably wouldn't want the camera very up close. You can see lines and seams here for where really the way the model was made and where the texture is kind of flowing. I would probably maybe think about sending this over to something like Substance Painter, which has an auto UV on wrap, which would actually help in terms of the layout, or send it over to ZBrush and use ZBrush's UV tools. And even still, just looking at these two models, I still prefer this one, even with all of its problems, to this model over here. And the other thing to be mindful of is back in SketchUp, if we hop out of the warehouse here really quickly, this model, even though it doesn't look as impressive, actually has double the amount of edges and faces. This is about 56,000, and this one is almost 100 and something thousand polygons. That is a staggering amount for a not great looking model. So definitely use the warehouse. I love it. I think it's fantastic, but you've got to be very careful about the quality and standard of the models that you use. All right, let's move on. The next thing I want to talk about is actually less to do with the architectural rendering part or how to use SketchUp or Blender or D5 or Lumion, and has more to do with the actual prep work that you will actually want to do before you get started. And one of the most common mistakes that I see, and definitely one that I know I'm guilty of, is a failure to look for reference. Why this matters is we have a tendency to build and design spaces based on how we think they are, but not how they actually are. All right, let's take a look then at where you can go and get some really good design inspiration. And it'll cost you just a little bit of time. The first place that I will always go to when I start a new project is Pinterest. Now, I've been using Pinterest for quite a while, and there is an absolute wealth of reference images, more for interiors, I'm going to say, than for exterior rendering, but you can find that too. But if you're going to start a design project, I can't think of a better place to get almost an infinite scroll of new content. So for example, all you got to do is just type in something like black and white bedroom. And you can see this is my current D5 project that I'm working on. And you can see there's a huge amount that I've taken from some of the content that I saw online. So you can see here we've got different ideas, things like black walls, the use of black wainscot walls, even just mixing in different textures and materials. There's a huge amount you can get. Now, one thing I will say on Pinterest, you definitely do want to have an ad blocker installed. I'm, for example, using Chrome with an ad blocker installed, and you can see that's where these missing images are appearing from. There is a lot of ads on Pinterest, but just by using a default ad blocker, you can get away with eliminating a huge amount of sort of the clickbait nonsense that you don't really want on a site. Once you see an image that you really like the look of, it's easy enough to click it and save. You can then just type in any new search parameter in the search bar, and Pinterest will automatically update for you. Now, the second thing that I'm going to suggest everyone does is figure out a color palette. Now, this is absolutely something that I ignored completely when I started out. In fact, it didn't really matter to me. I just wanted to have a pretty render without realizing that you need to be very thoughtful of the overall color schemes. So this right here is Adobe Color. It's free. You can just type it into your search bar, go to it. And what I like to do is actually go to Trends, click on Trends, and you'll notice here we've got quite a lot of different concepts. We've got fashion, graphic design, illustration, UI, UX, and architecture. If we go ahead and click on View More, you can actually see how this works. There are thumbnails, and then Adobe has effectively sort of mined the image for the color palette, which is really, really, really cool. So you can just skim through these, and oftentimes when I'm trying to figure out what is a room supposed to look like, or what is the space supposed to look like, you know, oddly enough, if you start from a color palette it actually helps quite a lot. That way, if you've got to go back to the warehouse, or you've got to build your own models, or you've got to buy them online, you're already mindful of the overall color and tone. So for example, you can see here, we've got grays and browns and this really nice blue color going on. What's also really, really cool is if you find a color scheme or palette that you really like, you actually can get access to the hex code, which you could then go ahead and just paste in to your render engine, especially if you're changing the default material colors. So for example, that bed that we just had, I could go ahead and just copy this and change the bed sheets to whatever default color I want it. It's really, really cool. You can also download these if you've signed in to your Adobe profile. And one last thing on this, and I don't use this part very much, but you can go ahead and go to create. Now, I've only used this once or twice, but you can actually pick your own kind of color schemes. So you can see by moving these around, it will give you basically different harmonies for your actual color. So for example, if you had a sort of, let's say a very brown, I'm going to go ahead and just pick a, let's do monochromatic here first. I'm just going to find a nice brown color that we like the color. There we go. You can click on complementary and you can see now that the interactive color wheel will actually give you colors that are complementary. You can also click on triad and you can see where you're going to get basically a color scheme that will work well together. It's just really, really useful, and you can do some really nice stuff with this. Just a great free, currently, tool to have. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is really something that we often forget about when it comes to architectural rendering, which is interior design. Now, if you come at ArchVis from a different background, like a completely different background, like my first interaction with 3D was doing basically a Viscom or game art program. I knew nothing about how to set up or pose a room. You may want to look into learning about interior design. Now, in my case, that transferred into going to Udemy or Udemy, depending on your pronunciation, and buying an interior design course. So I used one of these by Erica Fogelman. She has a number of interior design courses available on Udemy, and oftentimes Udemy will run really sort of really like strong sales that can drop these down to $10 or $12. Or if you really want to support the user, go ahead and purchase them at the given price. I found this to be an incredibly useful resource, and I've learned more about how rooms should look and feel and what objects should go together more than I ever would have learned by trying to figure this stuff out on my own. I'll go ahead and leave a link to this course in particular at the end of the video. All right, let's bounce in really quickly into the next tip. The last thing that I want to talk about that I see students do, and that I know I did myself too, pertains to one simple thing, and that is lighting. More specifically though, our tendency to basically overexpose our renders by really cranking up the lighting. Now I'm looking at a scene here in D5, but this is also true if you're working in, to some degree, Twinmotion, whether you're using Path Tracer or not, but especially if you're doing interiors in Lumion. The best way to light those is really environment light, but we then have a tendency to go ahead and add a whole bunch of other lights to the scene. And so here we are in D5, and you can see I've gone ahead and turned off the auto exposure. So what I'm seeing is an image that's pretty dark. So there may be a tendency then to decide that, hey, I'm going to go ahead and add some extra lights. So if we go ahead and, for example, you may do this in Lumion and Twinmotion, you're probably going to go ahead and add a light outside, and then you're going to go ahead and rotate it so the light goes through the window, and then you're probably going to blast the intensity, because that's in many ways kind of what we've learned. You may also decide then that what your image needs is spotlights and lots and lots and lots of spotlights. And again, this comes from a good place. I think it comes from just a desire to show off your scene. And we kind of assume that to fix how your image looks requires really just more of a good thing, which is basically more lighting. And so now you can see you're getting to a situation where you're like, okay, I can see everything and it looks good. And we do this a lot. If you're coming from Lumion, especially, when it comes to spotlights, the default spotlight in Lumion is set to a staggering 300 strength, when really it should be somewhere closer to 30. And to some degree, this is the same in D5 as well. Some of the lights are quite strong by default. For example, I haven't used one in this scene, but the original #1 point light, if you actually place it, you can kind of see it's actually pretty strong. You get quite a strong spotlight off of it. So is there a better way to go ahead and kind of approach this? Yes, and what I'm going to suggest that you do is take the approach of doing it quite simply, one light at a time. I'm going to select the lights that I just placed, and I'm going to delete them all, and that should give us a pretty good starting point. Now, let's go ahead and look at the window light. You can see I've actually got quite a few lights out here as well. I'm going to delete this one too. I'm going to delete the one that I just placed outside. And even though the scene may be quite dark, and I'm going to just hide all of these. How is the best way to do this? Well, start with a one at a time approach to your lights. Here's the light that I have outside. Whether you're using D5 Twinmotion or something similar, you can go ahead and select those lights. And you can see what I can do is crank the intensity quite high, but also go ahead and change the color. All right, so now you can actually see in my setup, I'm going to go ahead and turn everything off here really quickly. By default, by bouncing around to the scenes in D5, you can actually see it's worth setting it. So here is just my outdoor window light on its own. Basically, the only thing that's really working right now is this outdoor light. And if I want to get a really strong idea of how this is working, go ahead and change your scene to a nighttime shot. This means that there's no exterior light coming in, and now I can see exactly how far my light is going, and I get to see how strong my light actually is. Now, you probably don't want light coming all the way this far inside from just a light that's outside, so you can go ahead and slowly start bringing down the intensity on this. And when you get it to a pretty nice spot, and when you get it to where it's kind of only hitting what you want it to hit, that's when you can go ahead and change the color back to its default, either white, or go ahead and change the temperature. And so if we do this by working our way around, we can actually slowly build up the light in the scene. So for example, my original spotlights, not the ones that I just placed for demonstration, I've gone ahead and taken these down from the default. Really, they're still probably a little too strong for the scene, but when we go ahead and add them to the rest of the lights, we can actually see that overall it's going to be a much nicer lighting system. Now, in D5 in particular, you have to be very mindful of the auto exposure tab. It is by default, I think, really great for working and setting up your scene, but when it comes to actually rendering it, you really do want to turn that down. This is very similar to, in Lumion, checking how the hyperlight is actually going to affect your scene. And so when it comes to lighting it, you just want to make sure that you get areas of light and areas of dark. And that's really what you're going for. You don't want a scene that's super, super bright with tons and tons of lights. You also don't want one that's really, really dark. Try to think of your scene and the lighting in your render in terms of overall volume light, and then the highlights and the shadows. And you need a mixture of all of them. All right. With that being said, I am going to go ahead and leave it there for today. Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. All right. Cheers.